Welcome back to the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat for this very special Women's History Month edition. Episode number 214, the late, great Susan B. Anthony. I have to tell you, I didn't know anything about Susan B. Anthony. I mean, I'm almost embarrassed to admit this. I knew she was on the dollar coin, and maybe she had something to do with women's rights to vote. Honestly, if some city slicker came and tried to convince me she started the Red Cross, I would have said, "How dare you? I know it's Clara Barton." No, seriously, I didn't know anything about Susan B. Anthony. But now I'm an expert. And by the end of this episode, if you take all the recommendations I make, you too can be an expert on Susan B. Anthony, who, again, had a fascinating life. So she was born on February 15th, 1812 in Adams, Massachusetts, named for Samuel Adams. So that's exciting. Anytime anybody's from Massachusetts, I'm a big homer. Some have even said I could be a little bit of a mass hole. I've never sworn in the history of the show. That's about as close as we'll get. Honestly, do me a favor. Without looking it up, would you be able to honestly answer whether Susan B. Anthony was alive when women got the right to vote? Like, would you put your life on the line? I had no idea. And when I found out the truth, she dies March 13th, 1906, 14 years shy of women getting the right to vote. I was devastated. Anyway, so she's born in Adams, Massachusetts, and she's from a Quaker family, and they didn't believe in toys, music, dancing, any type of frolicking. There was no fun going on, but they did believe in equal rights for men and women. So she's raised in a household where she was always taught to be equal to the men. So that obviously is a very important aspect of her life. She grows up she eventually finds herself in Western New York. Again, we're skipping around. There's no way to, all these episodes, I'm trying to give you the highlights, but she finds herself in Western New York, which was kind of like a hotbed for activism. You know, there was abolitionist, temperance, women's rights. That's where the Mormon Church was founded. There was a lot going on in Western New York. So she's there. She finds her way. Her brother, she actually ends up being part of the abolitionist movement. So she actually works in the Underground Railroad. She works with Harriet Tubman and helps escape slaves into Canada. So she's like right in there. One of her brothers goes to fight in Kansas with John Brown. You know, I've said this I'm on record as saying the Civil War, I think it started at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and her brother was out there with John Brown fighting in Kansas. So, again, huge abolitionist family. They believed in equal rights. There's a lot going on in Western New York. She actually meets Frederick Douglass out, and they become lifelong friends. So Western New York, hugely important in this movement. But in 1848, there was a women's suffrage or women's rights declaration written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they were in a room full of women's rights supporters, and they formulated the declaration, basically on the Declaration of Independence. And at the end, they announced that they're for women's rights, and you would have thought they killed everybody's firstborn in the audience. People were aghast. They couldn't even understand women having the right to vote. So even the women supporters didn't support women's right to vote. So this was hugely controversial. This is in Seneca Falls in 1848. Shortly after, Susan B. Anthony meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, and they go on to work together for the next 50 years, 50, on women's rights, etc. So, they work very closely, but Elizabeth Cady Stanton goes on to get married and has 7 kids, which Susan B. Anthony was not a fan. She was constantly giving her grief It definitely caused problems in the relationship at some points. But again, they worked closely for 50 years fighting for the right for women to vote. Susan B. Anthony was basically family. She helped raise the 7 kids. But it seems like, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed like maybe Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the brains behind the operation, and Susan B. Anthony just ran with it. She traveled the country. Again, we've talked a lot about this, but traveling for back then, while it was readily available, was not easy. It wasn't for the faint of heart. You're going on these dusty towns. There's no climate control. The trains aren't really all that comfortable. You're showing up sometimes in these towns, like a woman traveling by themselves, like she was getting hassled, getting hotel rooms and all that. So, and she would be on the road. She was giving like well over 100 speeches a year. She would travel to every corner of every county. She went to every county in New York trying to raise get the women's right to vote. I mean, she really, everything she did was for that. She would get mad at her, again, mad at Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but other women that got married and had kids, she's like, you need to dedicate your life to this. And she did. Every nickel that she earned all went back into the women's rights movement. She started a newspaper. Again, all money reinvested. She didn't spend any money on herself, basically, other than just sustenance. I mean, nothing went for any type of extravagance. So, working with, again, she had met Frederick Douglass in Western New York, and it's interesting. I don't even know if I have an opinion necessarily, but you think about Douglass was obviously looking to free the slaves, but also give them the right to vote. And there was a huge problem between Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass over this, because she was like dead set against, she thought you could do both, and Frederick Douglass thought you couldn't. And when you think about how history worked out, obviously black men got the right to vote shortly after the Civil War with the, 14th and 15th Amendment. And women didn't get the right to vote for like another, 60 years or 50 years. I mean, it's so crazy how it all worked out. But that was a huge, split between Anthony and Douglass, was the right to vote. Who should get it first? Again, hard to say. I don't know what the right thing. You think about that black men got the right to vote, and then in the South, once Reconstruction died, they had it taken away and didn't get it back for like another 80 years. I mean, people complain about government today. Can you imagine? Things move so slowly then. You couldn't get anything done. You think about from the time of the Seneca Falls Convention to the time women got the right to vote was 72 years. Every year that was brought in front of Congress and didn't get enacted for 72 years. So, I don't know. The House of Representatives has always been filled with knuckle draggers, mouth breathers. I don't know what you're supposed to do. Nothing gets done. So the idea, I know it's frustrating, but can you imagine? I just saw that they just passed a lynching bill that's been tried to be passed for 100 years. It's like, I don't know. I don't know what we're supposed to do. We're trapped. Allegedly, this is the best form of government in the world. So it is what it is. I guess we could be, I don't know. I don't want to say. But again, she would travel the country, every nook and cranny across the country, giving speeches. And in 1872, the presidential election, so she was a Republican. She would have supported Grant. She would have supported Rutherford B. Hayes in the stolen election of 1876. But in 1872, she actually just goes down, registers to vote. They were the person at wherever she went to vote was like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. So he lets her register. She votes for Grant in 1872, and she's quickly arrested for illegally voting. But she played it perfectly because it played right into her hands. She used the media to her advantage during the trial. She went to every, where the trial was being held. She went to every single neighborhood and town in the county to influence the jury. So they moved the into a different county, and then she went to every town in that county. So she was constantly using the newspapers. She was smarter than most of the people in the room. She knew government better, the state, local, and federal government, better than most of the sitting members of the government. So she knew all the dark secrets. She tried. She did everything she could to pass the women's suffrage. And when you think about, like, she was basically traveling the country, like, running for president. She was the most famous woman on the planet. Again, she knew the job of government better than most of the sitting members, especially in Congress. She probably would have been a great Speaker of the House. Again, knowing where all the skeletons were buried, like, she knew everything. So it's interesting. But again, and she traveled basically right up until the end. She was deep into her 70s. She was all over California giving speeches for women's suffrage. At age 80, she was actually celebrated at the White House at the invitation of William McKinley. So her birthday was a big celebration at the White House. Again, she never missed an opportunity, though. Anytime, like, people try to talk down to her, she was witty, smart. She knew the material, so she never got upset. She would always hit you with a comeback that made you look stupid. So that's Susan B. Anthony. So I've got a great book recommendation. Failure is Impossible. This was excellent because it's a lot, the way, it's not a typical biography per se. It's basically a lot of her own writing, and then the author comments about what was happening and who she was meeting with and what have you. We've been having the same arguments. I mean, some of this stuff feels ripped from the headlines. Equal pay for equal work, women's rights. I mean, we've been doing the same thing over and over for the last 150 years. I mean, sometimes when you're reading this and you're reading her own words, you feel like you're reading headlines from today. So, again, just women's rights, equal pay. Why do we keep having these same arguments? Anyway, TV recommendation. So I've mentioned Ken Burns on this show. He's an American treasure. He actually did a documentary on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It's a two-parter. It's 3 hours. It's totally worth your time. It is excellent. Totally worth it. So spend the time. I got it on Amazon Prime. I spent the $4 I bought it. It's really good. It's really informational. You learn a lot about Susan B. Anthony and Stanton. The other two things are just stuff that's been on recently. That Lincoln biography on History Channel. The History Channel can be tricky. Sometimes some of their stuff is like filled with conspiracy theories and wacky stuff. The Lincoln biography was excellent. The other thing, it was on HBO. It was only an hour long. It was on Frederick Douglass. It focused in on 5 of his speeches. That was pretty good too. So if you get a chance, check those out. Travel recommendation, going to be one that I haven't been to but would like to. If you remember from late last year, beginning of this season on the Gilded Age, I did an episode on Andrew Carnegie, the only episode ever done by a fireplace. I had a road trip, a Gilded Age American road trip canceled. Well, I'm trying to revive it. It might happen sooner than you think, but along the way, we're going to stop hopefully in Rochester, New York. Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass are buried nearby one another, and you can actually visit her home, which has been turned into a museum. So that's on my list. Stay tuned. We'll hopefully get there sooner than you think. And just we're finally getting close to the end of the Gilded Age. We'll probably have episodes into June. I'm currently reading the last book I'm willing to read for the Gilded Age. There's going to be people I miss. I can't do this show forever, or the Gilded Age forever. So I wanted to move on. So I finally said this was the last book, even though I said that like 10 times to myself as I added more books. But finally I am going to cut it off. This show's going to go through till June, and then maybe we'll go off the air for good. I do secretly put these episodes on a YouTube channel. If you search the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat, I believe you could find it. So if it ever leaves social media, it would probably end up on YouTube. I don't think anybody watches this anyway, so it's all for naught. But I probably get more out of this show than you do. I'm reading about people I normally wouldn't. But anyway, Till next time, this is Josh Kane of the Josh Kane Presidential Fireside Chat. Bye for now.